Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my LCK Week 4 overview, analysis, and of course at the end, my updated power rankings. Incredibly excited to jump into this one. We had some pretty interesting series here in week number 4. The LCK season has obviously been pretty explosive to start the year in 2023 so far, and I'm excited to go over another week of games here. If you are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. What series were you most looking forward to this week? Who impressed you? Who did not impress you? Who is raising in your power rankings? Who is falling in your power rankings? I would like to hear all of that, of course, down in the comment section below, but let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into our reviews. Of course, if you are new here, what we do on this channel is go through all 5 days, all 10 series of LCK action here in week number 4 in this video. Talk about my positives, negatives for each team, player of the game, dud of the game, all of that stuff. Gonna be going game by game, talking about everything, and then of course at the end, I will be giving you guys my updated power rankings after this week is over. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into game and day number 1. In our first series of the week to kick off day 1 was Liiv SANDBOX taking on the Kwangdong Freecs. And Liiv SANDBOX does pick up the win. This isn't particularly surprising. SANDBOX is playing way above expectations right now, and it just looks like they're going to continue to do so for quite a while. They take care of KDF, who has really struggled out of the gate with their very young roster. This is not a surprising win at all. I will say, KDF being able to take game number 1 here was a little bit shocking, if only just because it felt like SANDBOX didn't have control of that game really at all. It was really well done by KDF to kind of control the pacing of the game. I really liked their draft and to be able to move it into the back half and close it out. I was impressed by that. This was relatively close overall. Like, SANDBOX had moments where they were, supposed to be in the game. They kept it close, but at the end of the day, KDF really kept a tight grip, I would say, over game 1. Games 2 and 3, though, not so much. I mean, game 3 was definitely in the balance here, definitely winnable on the side of KDF, but golly, their macro was just so ridiculously awful at the end of game number 3. So let's go ahead and talk about SANDBOX. First and foremost, player of the series here is actually kind of difficult because I do think that there are a couple players that played well and a couple of players that didn't play well. It's kind of hard to find one player that I think played well the entirety of the series for SANDBOX, but for me, I'm actually going to give player of the series to Bertle in the top lane. I know a lot of people are going to want to see Closer get it here, but I have some gripes about how Closer played this series, and also, I feel like I've given a lot of love on the side of Liiv SANDBOX to the bot side of the map here over the course of the year so far. Closer, Envy, Kale in particular, I've been very high on in a lot of these post recaps. I don't think I've said nearly enough about the top side of the map, which has been incredibly positive for Liiv SANDBOX. That is another reason, and another big reason, I should say, why they are doing as well as they are, is I think Bertle and Willer in particular are still playing at an incredibly high level. I think Bertle had a really good series here. His game 1 was kind of boring on the Gnar, not really a lot happening up on top side, but game 2 and 3 were both good for different reasons. The Jason game 2 just absolutely destroyed laning phase, was able to snowball out of control, and then the Gnar in game number 3, Bertle actually did a really good job keeping pace with Dudu, who was actually doing a really good job making his presence known on the map. And so I think Bertle is deserving a player of the series. I think a lot of people, again, are going to give it to Closer, who was really good here in game number 3 in particular. I will say, I'm not exactly sure it was Closer playing super duper well in game number 3 as opposed to KDF just kind of giving Closer so many things in game number 3. Of course, you still have to be willing to take those, especially on something like an Azir, but I'll talk about it when we get to KDF. Closer was given so much time to just ramp up in the mid game here that it's actually ludicrous. It is pretty insane that they just kind of let the Azir get super strong and then eventually, just one-shot everybody in the game. That's kind of just what happened, and credit to Closer, he did his job, but I don't think it was necessarily him taking the advantage. I think it was more so him just capitalizing on the advantage that KDF gave him. So I'm going to give it to Bertle. I thought Willer was meh this series. His scoreline looks okay, but I honestly think Gen.G played really well, especially in game number 1 in that win, and so this was more of a performance that was kind of like on Willer, and I was kind of on the bot lane as well. I think Envy and Kale both had good moments, but Kale was kind of outplayed in game number 1 in the bot lane. Of course, a lot of people are ragging on Envy taking heal over cleanse in game number 1 into Jhin, Ashe, Sejuani. I do understand it into Sejuani and the Jhin. Those I do think really, cleanse helps you out a lot in the 1v1 and in the dueling matchups against them, but I want to say this about Ashe support. I think a lot of people look at Ashe support and say that cleanse is immediately, the right option. I think a lot of people forget that pre-6, Ashe does not have arrow. Cleanse going into Ashe isn't particularly valuable, and heal is actually incredibly valuable into Ashe, so you can actually trade with her pre-6. So I do understand the thought process going into that. I just don't think it ended up working out because Jin Sejuani was also there, and so Cleanse would have just been ridiculously high value in that game. I agree that it was probably an issue not to take it, but I think just like blanket saying that it's right against Ashe all the time, not particularly, you know, what I would consider correct, right? But I would say SANDBOX looking okay. Certainly not the most dominant series that they've had all year, but a win is a win. As for KDF, some good and some bad. I actually think you looked really good in game number 1, and I think parts of your team looked really good in game number 3. Game number 1 was everybody. I think everybody looked really solid, really like Gen.G on that Sejuani. I felt like he controlled the whole map. Bulldog, Taiyun in particular, probably had one of his best games of the entire split on the Jin here in game number 1. That gets taken away from him the rest of the series. And then Dudu, I thought, was fine in the top lane. He actually had a really good game number 3, did a really good job helping out the rest of his team. It's just the macro game of KDF just imploded. It completely disintegrated in game number 3. And I don't really know what to say about that. Of course, they're a young team that hasn't really played together all that long. Of course, a lot of these players coming up from LCK Challengers, but not on the same teams. Taiyun and June obviously coming up from DRX. Bulldog from KDF. Youngjae, I believe, was from Gen.G. And then Dudu obviously played for Hanwha Life last year. And so obviously, these guys haven't had a lot of time to practice and play together, but we are 4 weeks into the season. I would hope that macro is at least, like, on the table, is at least comparable to some of the other teams, and it didn't necessarily feel very good. The plays that I want to describe in particular, you hit this mid-game point where you're having Bulldog and Dudu teleport a lot, and you're basically setting your team up in a position where you're having Bulldog teleport away from closer. He gets, like, 2 free waves. You miss all 2 waves in the top lane because he backs and then teleports into the wrong lane, and then Dudu tries to match, and so he teleports in and immediately gets chunked out, and you're just losing like 6 waves of minions, and Closer's just getting legitimately like 2,000 free gold over you. I don't really understand what the point of this like mid-game transition was, but it didn't work. It did not work. It was very confusing. I don't know who was making that call, but it was, objectively speaking, the wrong one. Done of the series is actually kind of hard. Again, I don't think anybody played particularly awful, but I'm going to give it to Bulldog. Again, I think some of his play in game number 3 was just kind of bad. He was outplayed by Closer pretty spectacularly. I thought his game 2 on the Akali was solid, and his game 1 on the Azir was okay, but there really wasn't anybody on KDF that was like particularly bad all series long. I honestly think KDF did a pretty good job keeping pace with SANDBOX over the course of this series, and you know, that's a good thing for KDF, I would say. This is a team that really hasn't looked all that competent when it comes to playing a lot of the other, like, relatively good teams in the league. So to see them go up against a team like Liiv SANDBOX, kind of be able to hold their own, not really look completely dead in the water, not be able to win the series, but, you know, certainly be a side that can keep up and, you know, be at least relatively close to something like Liiv that, you know, 5-2 is a pretty good record to start with. I think that's a good sign for KDF and probably shows that they're a little bit better than maybe I was giving them credit for going into this week. They haven't had the best start to the season, but they have talent, and hopefully they can use that to kind of rebound here. As for SANDBOX, it's a win. It's not the cleanest win of the year. You're sitting at 5-2, which is fantastic, but cracks in the armor are starting to show. This is a team that, even in terms of how they've been able to play out the early parts of the season, I wouldn't particularly expect them to be like a Worlds team, like a top 4 team. I think it really just shows that the rest of the LCK is just kind of struggling this year so far, that there really isn't a team that looks better than them that deserves to be in the top 4. Not to say that they've looked bad by any stretch. I think they've looked really solid. I just don't know. You know, looking at this series, I would have wanted to see them destroy KDF, and that's just not what they did. They dropped game number 1. They kind of got lucky in game number 3. There were a lot of things that went their way that without that, they probably don't even beat a team like KDF, which is certainly one of the worst teams in the league, and so not exactly the most enlightening series in the world, but still some positives. I think your solo laners are solid. Your support is really, really good. Willer's had a good year so far, even if I didn't think he was perfect in this series, and Envy continues to grow every game, so if they can just continue to get better, SANDBOX should definitely continue on this kind of big hot streak, taking advantage of some of the other weaker teams in the LCK. Moving on to our second series here of day number 1. We had an interesting matchup that is always fun to watch purely for name value alone. We had T1 taking on BRION. T1 does take it 2-0, which they absolutely should, but it's almost a surprise. It is genuinely almost shocking when T1 actually just wins the games that they're supposed to win, because that's what this team does, is they lose the games that they're supposed to win, they win the games that they're supposed to lose, and then they sit at the top of the LCK by the end of the year, and it's formulaic, right? But T1 actually doing their job, taking care of Bro, moving to 6-1. Incredibly impressive and well done stuff here. And overall, honestly, they just looked dominant. I think pretty much everybody on the team really showed up and looked really, really good. I can't really think of a single person that I would call out as like a weak link of T1 at really any point in this series, and so big credit to them. Player of the series for me, gonna go to kind of this bot lane as a duo, but I really am going to give it to KIA. I know some people are probably gonna get a little frustrated that I'm not giving enough credit to Gumayushi, because I do think Guma has been very good, and he gets a pentakill in game number 2, and I'm not giving him player of the series, but I mean, it's just really hard to watch these games and not be like, KIA is just way too freaking good. Like, he just is too good. The Nami, especially, in game number 2, he plays it like it is Ashe. He gets the Ashe in game 1. He does a great job being able to perma-stun Bro and set up a lot of these team fights for the rest of the team, alongside the Sejuani, owner Sejuani, which was huge in game number 1, really to set up that Sivir to do a ton of damage. But then in game 2, he's basically Ashe again, where he's got this perma-stun, except this time, it's not on one person, it's on the entire enemy team with the Nami ultimate with bubbles. They're basically point and click for KIA. He's just too good at this champion. His laning ability in the 2v2 is second to none. Literally in the league, there is nobody in the league that can keep up with KIA when it comes to his laning ability, especially on a champion like Nami. And then his ability to play these late game team fights, that's what separates him from the rest of these Nami players. Nami's always going to be relatively good early and in the mid game, but being able to really dominate a lot of these late game team fights, to be able to land your CC super consistently, set up your late game hyper scaling AD carry in order to win that, you know, late game is just incredibly impressive. And KIA is the MVP of the league for me right now. He's the best player in the LCK as of, you know, week number 4 so far, and it's just been incredibly impressive how he's been able to play this year, not only with the crazy picks, which he's obviously getting a lot of recognition and praise for, but with these, you know, very standard normal picks as well, and just being able to do them better than basically anybody else in the world. I gotta give a lot of credit to Guma. It certainly isn't just KIA dominating those 2v2s in the bot lane. Guma has also stepped up and played really, really well this year. T1's bot lane, in my opinion, has been the best in the LCK. I don't think that's a particularly shocking statement to say. I think Guma and KIA, if they just continue like this, they are one of the top 2 or 3 bot lanes in the entire world. And you know, KIA is the best support in the world. Gumayushi, in my opinion, a top 3 to 5 AD carry in the world ever since last year. I think that when these two are on, when these two are playing the League of Legends at the highest level and the best level that they possibly can, there's basically no one that can beat them, especially bot lanes, no offense, like Hanwha and Effort in this series. Credit to Owner, he was phenomenal in game number 1 on the Sedge. Zeus is still undefeated on the Gragas, and Faker is Faker. He just has this permanent buff where the enemy team will lose the game to try and kill him, and so that happened again here in game number 2. So overall, everyone on T1 looking really good, but I have to give a special shout out to the bot lane, which just continues to be fantastic. As for Bro, not a particularly great series. There were some moments that I think he looked all right in. Most notably, I think Karis actually had some moments where he looked okay, both in game 1 and in game 2, but mostly in game number 1 on that Azir, he looked a lot better than he did on the Akali. That's always kind of been Karis' thing, is he's a little bit passive and lame, isn't someone who's necessarily going to dominate you in the 1v1, is someone who's going to be looking to scale and then kind of just be useful to the team rather than be the big, you know, flashy carry. That's not really what Karis has ever been in the LCK, at least over the past year or so. That definitely kept up here, even if he didn't make any major mistakes. I thought also made some pretty decent plays, but for the most part was just out-jungled by Owner. He went for a lot of those risky plays on the Wukong, a lot of those engages. Some of them were able to work, you know, he was able to get on them in the mid-game, but, you know, by the time we hit the late game and Zeri is peeling, and you've got the Nami playing really well, and you've got Gragas and Vi, and so many ways to keep the Wukong off of your backline, just has a really hard time actually playing out those fights, which is unfortunate. But those were the 2 players that I thought were kind of the most flashy out there for Bro, even if they weren't perfect. Dud of the series is a pretty easy choice for me. It's going to go to Hanwha in the bottom lane. Just got completely outplayed by Guma, got completely outplayed by KIA. This Bro bot lane was just not on the same level as T1, and honestly, we shouldn't have ever expected them to be, because Hanwha and Effort, for as over-exceeding expectations as they have been at the start of this year so far, they're still not one of the best bot lanes in the LCK. I would still argue that they're close to the bottom, and so to go up against the best bot lane in the LCK right now and not be able to perform, I'm not particularly shocked on that. Hanwha didn't have a great series. This is kind of just what we know of Hanwha. He's an AD carry that can compete against the lower tier teams in the LCK, is going to be able to step up and play well when the rest of his team is doing well, but he's certainly not someone who's going to be able to face the competition at the highest level and actually be able to keep up. And Effort certainly is having a better year than he did last year on Nongshim, where he was maybe just the worst player in the LCK, but it's still not going to be enough to be able to keep up with a player like KIA, who is legit the best player in the LCK right now. So unfortunately for Hanwha and Effort, they're going to get my dud of the series here. But overall for Bro, I would say not the worst loss in the world. You were able to at least kind of keep up in game number 1, but again, you're throwing everything away to kill Faker in game number 2. It just kind of happens. Sometimes you get mind controlled by T1 and by Faker, and you just end up losing the game, and it is what it is. But for Bro, they're exactly who we think they are. They are a team that is just outside the playoff race. I have them at number 7 in my power rankings. I really don't see a lot in this series that makes me change my mind on that. They should have gotten beaten by T1, and they should have gotten beaten handily, and that's exactly what happened. For T1, I'm honestly kind of surprised that they actually did take care of business. This is the kind of series that they usually drop at least one game in, but good for T1 to be able to take this. Your bot lane is playing at a, galaxy level right now, like the best in the world, and if they can keep that up, T1 is going to be a team that is not easily beaten by anyone. Owner's playing well, Zeus is playing well, Faker's playing well, everybody on T1 is clicking right now, and they are really proving why I was right to have faith in them as the number 1 team in the LCK after last week. Jumping into day number 2 now, we had an interesting matchup, a little bit of an upset here, as we saw KT Rolster taking on Dplus KIA, and KT Rolster picking up a massive victory here in week number 4. Pretty nice bounce back for a team that just lost to the Kwangdong Freecs, giving them their first and only win of the year so far to go on and beat Dplus KIA, a team that most people consider to be one of the best in the entire league. Certainly the KT way. That's just kind of what this organization, what this roster does. But honestly, they did it in a way that gives me hope that this is not some sort of one-off, that this is not some sort of just big shock upset. Dplus really struggling right now, and KT kind of taking advantage. They did it in a way that makes me feel pretty comfortable, which is looking much better in games 2 and 3 and doing it in the roles that have been incredibly positive for KT all throughout the year already. I was going to make a joke about this. I might as well. Aiming is my player of the series. Canyon is my dud of the series. What is this? 2022? This is last year. This is the same narrative that we had last year where everybody was like, Aiming is the best player in the LCK because he was playing like the best player in the LCK for that stretch of 3 to 4 weeks, and then everybody was aboard the Canyon is super overrated train, obviously before Worlds, when you can go back and look at the comment sections of a lot of my LCK videos last year, and people are saying that Canyon's not even a top 5 jungler in the LCK. I don't think we're going to get back to that narrative surrounding this, but it's just kind of funny how time is a flat circle, and everything ends up happening more than once, but let's go ahead and talk about this series. KT picking up the win. Aiming is my player of the series. This really was such a no-brainer. He has been probably the second best player for KT behind Lehens. This bot lane has been phenomenal for them over the course of the beginning part of this season, and it's really, really good to see them be able to click. I was really worried about the synergy between these two players in particular, with Lehens being such a madman in the support position, wanting to play super aggressive things, and typically speaking, wanting his AD carry to play something a little bit more passive, wanting to put them on kind of the more supportive of the two things in the bot lane, so Lehens can play something a little bit more aggro. We saw that a lot at Worlds when, we would see Ruler put on something like the Senna as opposed to, any sort of carry ADC so that Lehens could play Singed or whatever he ended up wanting to pull out that game. But it's really kind of been the opposite here. Lehens has really just picked up the meta incredibly strongly. 3 games of karma coming out from him in this series. Aiming gets to pick up the Varus, he gets to pick up the Ezreal, the champions that he's always been really good at. And honestly, his consistency has just shot through the roof over the past year. It's been very, very fun to watch. He has been very good in the mid game. That's really where he has exploded in terms of, going from what he was in 2020 and 2019 to what he is now in 2023. That's really the biggest change for me, is he's never really been all that good at the early game, the early 2v2. Never really been his bread and butter. It's not really what he does at a high level, but it used to just be that if you could get into that late game and he could be relatively, even, he could be able to take over games. My comparison for him was a slightly better version of Danny, for all my LCS fans out there, where maybe not the strongest in lane, is going to make some mistakes, but is usually going to be relatively consistent when you get to the back half of games. The thing with Aiming that he's really upgraded is that mid game, that transition period from early to late game. He just gets online so much earlier now, and he becomes a problem so much earlier now that it really unlocks a different dimension for how this KT Rolster team in particular wants to play the game. So Aiming's going to get my player of the series, a fantastic game number 2 on this very Varus, where he just completely obliterates Defton Kellen in that lane. He's blowing up Showmaker, he's blowing up Canyon, he's blowing up Kana, he's blowing up everybody on the enemy team. He was still good in game number 3 on his signature Ezreal pick, but really this player of the series is for that game number 2, specifically on the Varus, where he was just completely and utterly dominant. Really, really fun game. Big credit to Lehens. He continues to look good. A little bit over-aggressive in this series, was stepping up a tad bit too much. I think pros at this level tend to mantra Q a little bit too aggressively for my liking. I think Mantra E obviously is just so good towards the back half of games, especially when you have an AD carry and a mid laner who are willing and able to do a ton of damage in a lot of these fights. I feel like Lehens didn't necessarily need to be the damage threat, made a few mistakes on that front, but still for the most part was incredibly positive, especially early on in games going into Defton Kellen and lane, who have been incredibly oppressive laners to have to play into, especially in game number 2. Ziggs Pike is something that could absolutely snowball out of control on the side of DK. Aiming and Lehens did a really good job to keep that in check. But they weren't the only players on the team to play well. I thought Cuz really stepped up. Cuz has always played well against Canyon. That's kind of just been how this matchup has gone, historically speaking. But Cuz had one of his better splits, or one of his better series of the year here. Really like that from him. Hopefully he can continue to kind of be this. This is kind of what Cuz has been. Very inconsistent. Mostly down, but can play really well against some of the players that he knows at a high level. And then the other player that I really want to shout out here is Keen. I know I haven't talked about BDD. He was fine in this series. We'll get to mid lane. It was kind of just a meh matchup there, but Keen in the top lane I thought was really good, especially in game 3 on the Jax. Overall, KT looking solid. Not really a lot of complaints coming out from me there. They looked like the better team in both games 2 and 3. As for DK, now you're on a losing streak. This is not particularly good. Your other losses are a little bit excusable. Obviously, Gen.G, a little bit less than T1. You would hope that you would be able to beat Gen.G, but they're not a bad team by any means, in my opinion. The second best team in the region, but KT Rolster, probably not a team that you should be losing to, and honestly, it was just because you underperformed here. We've been talking about how Defton Kellen have really been the focal points, I would say, overall, for DK over the course of the year so far. They kind of just got outplayed by Aiming and Lehens in the mid game and weren't really able to carry any of that pressure over into the late game. So who did you need to step up? You needed your jungle mid duo to step up. Canyon and Showmaker, these two powerhouses, and they just, quite frankly, were not good in this series. Showmaker was actually pretty solid in game number 1 in their win on the Victor. I actually thought he played that one really well. His positioning was solid. Game number 2 had some really good moments on the Sylas and was probably the best performing member of a DK team that just rolled over and died. But game number 3 for Showmaker was abysmally bad. I think Canyon was bad almost in all 3, but especially in their 2 losses. He's going to get my dud of the series. A lot of people forget Canyon had a lot of these struggles last year. This isn't some player that just was inflappable and has never gotten a dud of the series, of all time. Canyon is a little bit inconsistent, at least in terms of the regular season. Still one of the most talented, probably the most talented jungler in the entire league, but you are going to have some series where he plays, Vi and Sejuani and just goes in a little bit too aggressively and gets caught out and really isn't able to do much with it. That's going to happen with Canyon, and that's, I just think, what we got here in this series. Sometimes it happens. It's just unfortunate that it happened in a series against KT Rolster that I think you honestly wanted to walk out winning. I don't think anybody on DK looked particularly phenomenal here. I think Showmaker definitely looked the best in their wins, but he arguably looked the worst in their game 3 loss, so it's kind of difficult to get a read on where DK is right now. They are free-falling a bit. This is 2 losses in a row, which is more than you ever wanted to see for a team like Dplus KIA, but obviously talent on this team is going to reign supreme eventually. I assume Defton Kellen, they weren't bad, they just weren't as good as Aiming and Lehens. They have been kind of the carry point for DK over the course of the beginning part of the year. I expect that to continue. Canyon will bounce back, he always does. My biggest concerns are always going to be the solo laners for this team. Kana has definitely not been nearly as good as he was at the beginning of the year. Showmaker's really not had a good 2023 so far. He's had some good games here or there, but the consistency has absolutely not been there. And so for DK, I think that's really where the worry is going to start to set in, is can these solo laners get a little bit more consistent? Can we allow our jungle and our bot lane to be able to push us forward like they did at the beginning of the season? But for now, kind of a rough loss, but certainly not season ending. For KT though, this is a season defining win. You just got to be able to keep up the momentum here. This is very big. Aiming and Lehens continue to play really, really well. Cuz looked good in this series. Keen looked good in this series. BDD has certainly had moments where he's looked good this year. I think he was the weakest member of KT in this series, but overall, an absolutely massive win. This is a team that we are constantly flip-flopping back and forth between, are they like a top 4, top 3 team? Are they a bottom 4, bottom 3 team? They constantly live in both of these zones. I think luckily for them, the better version of KT showed up today, and they got an absolutely massive win out of it. Moving on to our second series here of day number 2, we had a top versus bottom clash. We've seen this a couple times in the LCK, and they are always quite interesting. We had Nongshim RedForce taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G does pick up the win here. Again, another non-surprising outcome, which is honestly surprising. Now, Gen.G as an org, typically a lot better than some of these other top teams like T1 and Damwon at actually beating the bottom teams in the league, but credit to Gen.G, they did take care of business this time in pretty commanding fashion. Game number 1, relatively close, I would say. Still very Gen.G favor. Game number 2, though, a little bit back and forth. Gen.G ends up taking it towards the back half with some really good engages from Doran that I'll talk about in a second. But overall, Gen.G looking really, really good. I would say that the team itself is just kind of clicking on a level that I don't think a lot of the other LCK teams are clicking on right now. They do feel like they are playing as a unit, which is really good, and it's something that this organization has always been really good at. But let's go ahead and jump into it. My player of the series here for Gen.G is going to go to Doran in the top lane. He's been kind of up and down, I would say, over the course of the split so far. Definitely Peanut and Pez have been the standout members of Gen.G, in my opinion, at the start of 2023, but really good series from Doran. Had a good game 1 on the Gwen, but really this player of the series is for the game 2 on the Camille. I'm not exactly sure they win this game without a lot of the Camille engages that they ended up getting out of Doran towards the back half of this game. Some really, really good flanks, some really, really good engages on the backline, making sure that Fiesta has a much more difficult time actively playing that Syndra, which is super important for Gen.G, especially when you start getting down to these late game team fights. You've got the Tristana able to pop off. You've got the Draven, who does have a little bit of gold, but Elise has kind of fallen off in terms of damage. Rakan is certainly only going to be there for, follow-up engage on the Camille, because he's not going to be able to get in on something like the Leona. Overall, it's really on the Camille in order to make plays in a lot of these late-game fights, and Doran does a fantastic job. Hopefully, he's able to keep up this form for the rest of the split, because as weak as I think he has been over, in my opinion, the first couple of weeks of the season, I do still think he is one of the more talented top laners in the entire region, in the entire world, so hopefully he can get back to some of that form that he had in 2022, although I will say mostly weak side in 2022. He's been given a little bit of a different role here, but did destroy Din in game number 2. Other players that I want to shout out, Chovy was phenomenal in game 2 here on the Tristana. Really, really good game from him. And then Pez and Delight continued to have really nice synergy in the bot lane. Delight got player of the game in game number 1 on broadcast. I totally understand giving it to him on the Ashe. He was solid. Pez was really good on the Sivir, following up on a lot of those engages that the Ashe was able to do. Overall, Gen.G just feels like a well-oiled machine. They feel like a team that works really well as a unit, that works really well together, and that really just doesn't lose the games that they're supposed to win, which is, a really good trait, I would say, to have here in the LCK. It was one of the biggest traits that drove them forward and drove them to the number 1 seed the last year in the LCK, was their lack of losing games, and, I think that will be the same here. As for Nongshim, you stayed relatively competitive in this series. It certainly wasn't a complete and utter blowout, but that's kind of what we've just said about Nongshim all year long. It feels like after every single series, we have the same exact conversation, which is, Nongshim was able to keep up with this team, but at the end of the day, they just weren't good enough to beat them. That is just who Nongshim is at this point. They're not really good enough to beat anybody, but they are good enough to be able to stay relatively even with a lot of the teams, even the best teams in the league, until eventually they're just not able to do that. The one player that was not even really at any point in game number 2 was Din in the top lane. He got completely and utterly destroyed on this Jace pick. He really needed to separate himself early, I would say, from the Camille. He certainly was not able to do that, and it eventually got to a point where it was so ridiculously Doran favored that it was almost impossible for Din to have any sort of impact in the back half of this game, and that's unfortunately what happened. The Camille was ridiculously influential in a lot of these late game team fights, and the Jace was outputting basically no damage. So Din's gonna get my dead of the series here. He wasn't the only one who played bad. I see a lot of people on Twitter and on Reddit talking about Vital and about how Vital hasn't been all that good for Nongshim. I was a little bit lower on Vital going into the year. A lot of people were talking about him as the hype, big, high-profile prospect, I would say, on Nongshim going into 2023. For me, that was always Sylvie in the jungle. I always thought he was going to be the one to break out, and then Fiesta is someone who I also like at this level. I think Vital is kind of close to that level. I just wasn't necessarily convinced that he was going to be that. I certainly don't think he played awful in this series. A lot of people look at the 2 games of Aphelios and say that he was completely trolling, completely ended the series away by picking that champion. Of course, these are also all the same people who sit there and complain about Zeri and Lucian and Sivir being the only AD carries in the meta, and then as soon as any other AD carry in the meta gets picked, they sit there and they write 45 essays on Reddit about how stupid the player is for picking it. You know, I'm not going to get into that, but I don't think Vital was particularly bad. I don't think Aphelios is a particularly imp pick. I think Vital was not nearly the biggest problem on the team. In my opinion, that goes to topside. But overall for Nongshim, it's another loss. It's another one of these games that has been all too common for Nongshim, in my opinion, over the beginning part of this season, which is to say games where they look relatively competitive, but yet aren't able to actually win any of them. That's just who this team is. They are one of the worst teams in the league. I know a lot of people on Reddit are like, oh, well, they could take a series off of the best teams in the league because they are competitive and they look more competitive than some of the other teams that I'm ranking ahead of, teams like Nongshim right now. And while that is true, Nongshim really struggles to win games, and that is what you need in order to rise in power rankings, is to win games, and that's just not something Nongshim does relatively efficiently. And so, yes, I think Nongshim has talent, and I don't even think this is necessarily a bad thing for an organization that is just trying to see what they're going to get out of some of this young, unproven talent that they brought up for 2023, but this conversation surrounding Nongshim about them potentially like turning things around and being a top 6 team, I'm just not a part of that conversation right now. This team has some major problems that I think they absolutely need to work out that they have just not done so yet. As for Gen.G, they are one of the best teams in the league. I have them at number 2 in my power rankings. I think they are going to be right around there when the week ends. This is another really solid win. You were able to take care of business against Nongshim. Doran looks a lot better in the top lane. Your bot lane looks really, really good. And Peanut and Chovy, we know, have a fantastic chemistry together in terms of how they want to play the game. And so overall, Gen.G just continues to look really, really solid. Hopefully they're able to keep it up. This is a team and an organization that it's really hard not to cheer for. And overall, I'm just hoping that there isn't anything that changes that as the year goes on. Moving on to day number 3 now. We're about halfway through the week here, and we kick off our day number 3 with a matchup between Hanwha Life Esports and BRION. That Hanwha Life is able to pick up another win in, and guess what? This team is now above 500 for the first time this year. That is fantastic for Hanwha. You've got to be incredibly excited for them. Clearly, they have needed this for quite a while. This is a team that has a ridiculous amount of talent on the team. They've just never really put it together so far at the beginning of the year. They look like they're finally starting to go on a little bit of a run, though. Bro definitely holds their own in this series. It's not a complete and utter destruction by any stretch. Bro, especially in game number 2, is definitely competitive and definitely keeps it interesting. Game number 3 was pretty close, rather boring, but pretty close. Overall, Hanwha's going to be happy with the win. Bro's not going to be devastated with the loss. I actually think this is a series that looks relatively okay for both teams. On the side of Hanwha, Viper is going to be getting my player of the series here. He has finally started to come out of his shell in the LCK. I was really getting worried at the beginning of the year because he was really struggling to play as well as he did on a team like EDG back in the LCK. Obviously, a lot of things were not clicking for Hanwha Life. Their jungle position was a disaster. Their top side really wasn't playing all that well, and Life was really, really bad to start the year. But I was really worried that Viper, leaving EDG, leaving the system that really had, invested a lot of resources into him, especially towards the back half of the season last year. I was worried that that was going to be an issue, that he wasn't going to be nearly as effective. However, it just looks like he needed a little bit of time to adjust because he was actually fantastic in this series. Very deserving in my player of the series. Was great in game 1, was especially great in game number 3 here in the last half of that game. Obviously, credit to Life, who I think enabled him really well, especially on that Lucian Nami in game number 3. But credit to Klid. I know we've been very critical of Klid, but he was my player of the week in the entire LCK last week in week number 3, and he had another pretty solid series here where he was definitely just the better jungler out of the two of these players. And Klid really feels like he is settling in. This is something that I really respect when it comes to a lot of LCK junglers in particular. We've actually seen this a lot over the years with players like Klid, players like Canyon, players like Peanut. Some of the best players at this level where they'll have stretches of time where they're just not all that good, where they play like some of the worst players in the league. They've all gone through stretches like that at points in their careers, but they know how to not stay tilted, which I think is an incredibly impressive thing. I'm not sure if it's coaching, I'm not sure if it's atmosphere, I'm not sure if it's just players knowing how to shake it off, but Klid did a really good job of recognizing that he was making a ton of bad plays at the start of the year and realizing that he just needs to limit those for the team to be good, and that's what he started to do. He's played exactly towards the win con of Hanwha Life. So credit to Klid. Zeka continues to be fine. 3 games of Azir. Not exactly what you want to see on Zeka, but still he played them fine. Really, this was about the bot lane for Hanwha. It was about Viper really coming out of his shell, really being able to do a lot of damage in these team fights, and really being able to take over the game for Hanwha Life. That's kind of how you want to see a lot of these wins go on the side of Hanwha. If they can win through bot lane, they're probably going to be winning a lot of games. As for Bro on the other side, not necessarily a bad series. Like I said before, you looked really good in game number 2, where quite frankly, you decimated them. And then game number 3 was relatively competitive up until some really awful macro plays from your jungler towards the back half of the game. That is why, for my money, is going to be getting the dud of the series. We've talked about him a bit at the start of the year so far, with the fact that he took the starting job from Raptor, or at least it looked like they were going to be bringing Raptor in as the starting jungler. He gets sick before week number 1. Comes out and has a really good week number 1, one of the best players in the entire league to start the year. They clearly just want to roll with him for the rest of the split, or at least for now. He has not necessarily lived up to that expectation ever since then. He's been fine, but when he goes up against good teams and good junglers like this, he definitely starts to show his cracks in the armor. He had a really bad game number 3 here macro-wise on the Vi, quite frankly, threw away the game at Baron. For Bro, and so you've got to be a little frustrated with that, but there are some positives to take away here. Karis was phenomenal in this series. He actually went up against Zeka and looked like the better mid laner, which is incredibly impressive to say. Karis is someone who I've never really been all that high on. I've thought he has potential. Like, I don't think he's, someone who is just not capable of playing at this level, not capable of getting better, but I've never really had a lot of thought that he was going to turn into like a really solid, stable mid laner at the LCK level. It just seems like he's someone who is going to be a fine mid laner for a bottom team, but this was a really good series. He outplayed Zeka, especially in game 2 on that Akali. You don't really want to give him that Akali ever again. That's really what I'm feeling. Like, he was that good on that champion, just completely started snowballing the game out of control. Morgan looked really good in the first 2 games on Kasate, ended up ruining his perfect KDA in game number 3, which is frustrating, but it is what it is. Henna and Effort, I will say, continue to not really be anything. They were just significantly worse than Viper and Life in this series. I actually think Effort was fine, was landing some bubbles, especially in that game number 2 on the Nami, but Henna, for the most part, just does 0 damage for Bro. He is definitely, in my opinion, one of, if not the weakest AD carry in the LCK, and he continues to prove that. But overall for Bro, pretty decent showing. Honestly, could have been a lot worse, and you're sitting here at 3-5. It's not the best record in the world, but this is not really a team that was expected or planning to get to the playoffs. I do think that they've been relatively competitive in a nice kind of way, and hopefully they're just able to keep that up. If they're able to be like a semi-competitive, tough out that never makes playoffs, like, that's a pretty good end result, I would say, for this Bro construction of this roster. And then for Hanwha, another solid win here. You're back above 500 for the first time this year. That's got to feel incredibly good. Hopefully this is the start of this team really coming together. Klid is back on track. It feels like Viper and Life are back on track. Those are the 3 players that you really needed to step up. Zeka was always playing well at the beginning of the year. And then Kingen is Kingen. We just kind of know what we're going to get out of him. He's a good weak side top laner, but not someone who's ever going to be a superstar up in that top lane. And so for Hanwha, you're really just hoping that the consistency ends up continuing here, because if you get the version that you saw out of this bot lane and out of this jungle position in this series for the rest of the year, this team might actually start living up to the expectations people had of them. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 3. We had a matchup that was very fun last year. One of my favorite matchups between organizations to talk about. We had Liiv SANDBOX taking on DRX. These 2 teams have had a lot of really fun games against each other. Last year was an absolute blast to watch these 2 play. I talked about that a lot in my reviews last year, but obviously very different circumstance this year. DRX not necessarily on the same level as they were in 2022, and Liiv SANDBOX proves that by taking the series 2-1 here. 2-0 week for Liiv SANDBOX. They continue to look really good. They're 6-2 in the league right now. That's really, really good. I understand that their wins haven't necessarily looked super dominant, but pulling out wins is hard to do. To do it as consistently as they've been able to do it, it is worth congratulating them and giving them some respect for, because they've earned it so far. This is a team that, me included, thought was going to be kind of lower mid-table, like a non-playoff team. That has absolutely not been the case. This team has definitely proven it deserves to be in that playoff conversation above a team like DRX that we all thought was going to be in there. So what ended up happening in this series? Well, SANDBOX wins games 1 and 3. They look great in both of them. Honestly, they are significantly better than DRX in 1 and 3, although they do kind of get slapped around a bit in game number 2. It just happens. That's kind of the Liiv SANDBOX experience so far this year, is they look really good in 2 of their 3 games, and then one of them they'll just throw a little bit, which is fine. It happens, It's the consistency that I was worried about going into the year with this team, but they have been more consistent in terms of being able to pull it together in that game number 3 than I ever anticipated. My player of the series is going to go to Bertle again here in the top top lane. Another really good series from him. This game number 1 was disgusting. He solo killed Rascal 4 different times as the Jace going into the Gnar. I understand that that is an incredibly Jace-favored matchup, and obviously, if you're better at Jace there, you should be able to control the lane, but solo killing him 4 times in that game is absolutely disrespectful and utter domination coming out from BRION. He's actually been really good over the course of the year. I talked about this in their first series of the week. I think BRION hasn't gotten nearly enough credit for how good he has been. I think Willer and Closer are getting a lot of the credit. Kale and Envy are definitely getting a lot of credit as well, but BRION just seems to be the one that's kind of flying under the radar, but he has been just as big of a piece towards this SANDBOX team playing as well as they are right now as anyone on the team is. And so BRION absolutely deserving of that player of the game. You could criticize him a bit for going Yone in game number 2, which I think was pretty troll in my opinion, going Yone Jace into a Scion that you know is a Scion. It's already been picked in game number 2. Definitely not exactly setting yourself up to win the game, but for the most part, games 1 and game 3 were really, really solid from BRION, and he deserved that. Other players that I gotta shout out, Willer in the jungle continues to look like genuinely one of the best junglers in the league. You couldn't give me enough of a reason to understand why Willer was not playing over on Fleek on Hanwha Life last year. It was something we talked about a lot on the channel last year, was like, Willer's on this team. Where is he? He showed some good things in 2021. What happened to 2022? Well, this raises even more of a question mark because clearly Willer is an incredibly talented jungler at this level. He comes back into the LCK here on a good team, a team that is much better than the Hanwha team he would have been playing around last year, and he genuinely looks like a top 4, top 3, top 5, you know, somewhere around there, jungle in the LCK. Like, he has been consistent, he has enabled his laners, he has been able to generate leads not only for himself, but for everybody on his team. You just got to give him a big shout out. This is someone who has been given another opportunity very similar to a player like BRION and even a player like Envy. A lot of second opportunities here on SANDBOX, and they are absolutely making the most of it. The other player that I just have to shout out is Kale. I know I talk about him way too much on this channel, but he is legitimately a top 3 at worst, probably, support in the LCK. Maybe top like 5 or 6 support in the world right now. He's legitimately that good at playing out these early game 2v2s and playing out the fights in the late game. He just has every facet of the game. His laning 2v2 is better than pretty much everybody else's in the world. He is really that good at being able to control how the enemy AD carry plays the game. He allows Envy so much freedom early on in these games to make whatever decisions he wants. And then he can pull out something like the Sona, be really dominant in the early game, and even transition that into mid-game dominance. Obviously, a lot of people are going to get on his tail. And same way with Beryl for, you know, buying too many control wards and, you know, delaying Mythic. But the funny part is, it almost doesn't matter with a player like Kale because he is so ridiculously good at positioning and playing out these lane advantages that even if he is like equal in gold when he's supposed to be up, he's so much better that it looks like he's up in gold. He can kind of get away with it. I understand the idea behind people getting mad about too many control ward purchases. I'm certainly not as vitriolic as some of the other analysts are about it out there. Quite frankly, if you want my honest opinion, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Like, yeah, you're not optimizing, but you're really not like an anti-optimizing either. You're still using your gold in a good way. It's just not, I guess, the optimal way. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's not perfect, but at the end of the day, you're not really hurting your team. So I don't really understand why it is such a frustrating thing to watch and see happen. I know Kale is supposed to be a merchant of that, and I get it, he buys a lot of control wards, but still, I mean, if you want to use that as an excuse to not call him a top 3-ish support in the LCK, I don't really agree with that. That is something that I'm not going to be on board with. Closer and Envy were there. They were fine. Closer had a little bit of a down series. It happens. Fate was really good here, even though he kind of trolled draft a bit. But for DRX, yikes, 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 yikes. This team's 1-6. What do you want me to say? This team is an absolute disaster. They are a disappointment. They are the LCK's version of Excel and the LCK's version of Dignitas, a team that absolutely should be better, but is so much less than the sum of their parts right now. Even the players that had been playing well up until this point really disappointed in this series, most notably my dud of the series here in Rascal. I know a lot of people were talking about Rascal being elo held on DRX. I was kind of on this train through the first couple weeks of the season, but it looks like the elo is starting to get to Rascal just a tad bit here. Like I said, solo killed 4 times in game number 1. It's just disappointingly bad. He wasn't particularly good in games 2 or 3 either. 2 he was good in, but that was mostly because he's playing Scion into a basically full AD comp. And then game number 3, he was bad again on the Cassante. And so Rascal with a pretty poor series, easily, in my opinion, his worst of the split so far, which is frustrating because he's probably been the most consistent member of DRX through the first couple of weeks. As for the rest of the team, a lot of people are going to look at Fate's scoreline and say, oh, he was fantastic. He must have been the saving grace for DRX, the one keeping them in the games. Kind of, I guess. He played okay. I felt like he didn't do nearly enough with some of his leads. They end up in game number 3, taking R5 LeBlanc in order to counter this Azir. He goes Airy LeBlanc and just does no damage, and I just don't understand this. I'm low on LeBlanc as a pick. I think it's worked at the pro level, but I think you need to snowball it. You need to invest a lot into it, which Krako attempted to do. And honestly, he did generate quite a bit of a lead for Fate in game number 3 here on the Vi. Did the same thing in game number 2 on the Maokai with the Azir. He spent a lot of time mid, making sure to generate that lead so that Closer was behind. And Fate just did absolutely nothing with it in game number 3. I know a lot of people are going to say that Fate was good in the series. I don't necessarily think he was all that good in the series. I think Krako honestly gets a bad rap. I think he's been a lot better over the past few weeks. He knew what his win condition was in these games, which was try and get mid lane ahead and try to snowball that out of control if Dectum can get to the late game where he can win these team fights, but unfortunately Fate was just not able to carry it in game number 3. Rascal didn't play particularly well, and then credit to the top side of Liiv SANDBOX. They did a really good job of transitioning their early lead into some late game pressure, but overall for DRX, this is surprisingly not the worst series that they've had in recent times. Comparing this to some of the other series that they've had in the past few weeks, this is honestly a breath of fresh air. I don't think the bot lane was all that bad. I think Krako and Fate showed like some level of macro awareness, like of an idea of how to win the game, which is something they have really struggled with. If they just fix some of the micro, if they fix some of the 1v1 mistakes, I do think DRX could be a team that genuinely is, like, in, you know, the conversation for being, like, number 8 instead of number 10, but right now they are legit number 10. Like, they look like the worst team in the LCK. As for SANDBOX, you just keep the winning ways going. It's not the perfect series. You lost a game to DRX in pretty commanding fashion, but at the end of the day, a series win is a series win, and that's all you're really going to worry about. If the top side can continue playing like this, you know, Closer and Envy having a down series not even mattering, that is a really good sign for SANDBOX. This is a team that definitely has shown that they belong in the top 5, top 4 teams in the LCK right now, and I, for one, am just incredibly happy and excited to say that. Moving into day number 4 now. We're getting towards the back half of the week, which means we're getting our second series of the weeks here. And we finally get our rookie matchup this year, the one we've kind of been looking forward to in a weird sense. We get Nongshim RedForce taking on the Kwangdong Freecs, 2 very young, rookie-oriented teams, and it's actually KDF that picks up a very big win here. They looked okay earlier on in the week, but really, this is a huge win for them, a shockingly big win for them. I actually think they played really well in this series, a couple players in particular that I'm definitely going to shout out, but for Nongshim, you've got to feel a little bit frustrated. I mean, this is a team that has been consistently close to beating a lot of the other teams in the league, but has never really been able to actually beat any of the other teams in the league, and then you kind of get a little bit trounced here by what a lot of people consider to be the weakest team in the Kwangdong Freecs. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For KDF, player of the series, super easy choice for me here is going to go to Dudu in the top lane. He was just phenomenal in both games here. Was incredible on game number 1 on the Fiora. Was really good in game number 2 on the Cassante. You're going into the Sion, but look at the team comp that they drafted to go into something like Sion. You've got Azir, you've got Ezreal, even something like the Cassante. You've got ways to deal with a Sion in this particular instance. And so Dudu actually does a really good job of being able to generate a really strong lead up on top side. This actually felt very similar, in my opinion, to a lot of the wins that Hanwha Life had last year in 2022 when they relied on Dudu to be able to pick up a lot of those wins. I think that he actually did a really good job here of being able to understand that if he got ahead on the Fiora, that they would not have the pressure to be able to wait for Jax Kassadin to be, you know, a problem in the late game. That Fiora would basically force the game over too quickly for that to matter, and that's exactly what happened in game 1. And then game 2 already talked a bit about the Sylas, but kind of just maneuvering around, you know, your Maokai, Sylas, Aphelios little triple combo there that you really want to set up for a lot of these team fight engages. You know, moving around that and just getting opportunities for your Ezreal in particular to be able to shine. I think that's what Dudu did really well in the top lane here, and big credit to KDF. This is the kind of series that you wanted to see out of your veteran presence on what is otherwise an all-rookie team. The other player that I really want to shout out for KDF in this series is actually Taiyun. Taiyun's actually been someone who I've been very critical of. I think him and June have easily, in my opinion, been the worst bot lane in the LCK. They have just not been good. They have been getting run over in basically every series when this team wins. It is often because of Youngjae and Bulldog, but Taiyun and June were actually really solid in this series. The Ezreal game in particular was really good in game number 2. He was actually able to output a pretty ridiculous amount of consistent damage in those team fights. Clearly, it's a champion that he feels comfortable on. Obviously, a lot of people are going to say it's because they're going into Aphelios, and I do kind of understand the thought process behind the Aphelios pick. Again, team fighting monster. You're going to be able to control a lot of this late game if you ever do get there. You draft the Maokai, you draft the Scion. There's a lot of peel here, a lot of engage with the side of the Nautilus as well to be able to set up this Aphelios to kind of just 1v9 towards the back half of this game. Unfortunately for Nongshim, they won none of their lanes, and so they never were able to get to a point where they were actually able to scale into that. But credit to Taiyun and credit to June. They were really, really solid here. Ezreal Braum, I think, is almost underplayed at this point at the pro level, and then obviously credit to Dudu. Youngjae and Bulldog were actually, in my opinion, the weak links of the team, quote-unquote. Youngjae was really, really good in the jungle, but Bulldog a little over-aggressive for my taste at points in this game on the Azir. But overall, KDF just looked like the better team all around. They won every single lane, both games, and they were pretty dominant doing so. As for Nongshim, pretty frustratingly bad game, I would say overall. Remember, bad series. No one looked good. Like, I can't really point to someone and be like, well, at least they showed up. It felt like everyone lost, and everyone lost hard. I think Vital made some pretty solid plays in game number 2 on the Aphelios, but overall, that pick was just simply never going to work if you weren't able to generate any sort of early lead somewhere on the map so that you can transition into the late game a little bit more efficiently. Peter was going in and dying on the Nautilus. We'll get to Fiesta in a bit, but I don't think he had impact on the game at all. Sylvie got out jungled by Youngjae and had no pressure, and Din Din played a champion in game number 2 that was supposed to die on purpose, and he gave so much gold over to the enemy tank that they could never burst through him. So yeah, Nongshim did not work out. Fiesta is my dud of the series here. Game number 1 on Kassadin, it's just such a bold pick in game number 1 here, going into Maokai, Azir, Zeri to pick, and even Fiora, to pick something like Kassadin. You're really relying on the fact that you're eventually going to hit that power spike. Unfortunately for Nongshim, they just did not get to the point in the game where they hit that power spike. They were too far behind at that point to really be able to win the game. Very, very, I want to say cocky. That feels like the wrong word here, but a very cocky pick overall from Fiesta there. And then he had zero impact on the Sylas in game number 2. Was kind of outplayed by Bulldog. They tried to set up some things around the mid lane, but it just never worked out. The rest of the team comp was really designed around getting the Aphelios ahead, and Fiesta did not get the memo because he was playing so risky without really making any sort of plays. And so, yeah, Fiesta deserves dud of the game for me, or dud of the series. I think you could give it to Din Din in the top lane. He was also bad in this series, but I guess you could say that dying in game number 2 was on purpose because he's Scion, and that's kind of what you do on that champion, but he wasn't particularly good in game number 1 either. You could give it to Vital and Peter because they really weren't accomplishing the goals that they had in the bot lane. Sylvie got out jungled. Everybody lost on the side of Nongshim. It really is up to artist interpretation is what I will say in terms of who gets dud of the series. But overall, Nongshim looking like the worst team in the league. They just lost to the worst team in the league by a large margin, and Nongshim is right in that category with them now. I think it's them, DRX, and KDF slightly above in terms of being the bottom of the league, but good for KDF. You picked up another win here. You're sitting at 2-6. It's technically not dead in the water, your season, that is, as it is right now. You can still kind of go on a big winning streak and get back in. I'm not particularly stoked about this team's chances of doing that, but, you know, being able to pick up a win over Nongshim, proving that you're not the absolute worst team in the league, I feel like that is a small win in and of itself, especially with how this team has been playing recently. Moving on to our second series here, though, of day number 4. We had another really fun one. A battle between two top teams. Am I allowed to say that at this point? We had KT Rolster taking on Gen.G. And KT Rolster with another win. They go 2-0 this week, beating Dplus KIA and Gen.G. What a week for KT. I mean, I don't even really know how to respond to this. I don't really know how to take this. Huge win for them, but we have to remember they ended off last week losing to the Kwangdong Freecs. So, and I get, yeah, like, great. KDF just won a series earlier today, but are you kidding me? Like, I don't know how to view this KT Rolster team. They looked awesome in this series. They didn't look particularly good in Game 1, but Games 2 and 3 were definitely in their control. Now, Game 3 definitely took a little bit too long, in my opinion, to close out, but they still ended up winning it, and that's what matters in the end. So let's talk about it. For KT Rolster, my player of the series, there were a couple of options, in my opinion, for KT, but the one I settled on was BDD in the mid lane, who, in their wins, has looked really, really good. I actually think BDD generally as a player has been very positive for KT Rolster. Him, Aiming, and Lehens I think have looked good as a trio. And I think that definitely showed up in this series. BDD, honestly, quite frankly, just outplayed Chovy. Chovy had a little bit of a down series, we'll get to that, but BDD really stepped up against his former and classic organization here in Gen.G, looking really good. The Kassadin game in Game 2 had some really good moments, but for the most part, you know, Aiming was kind of Game 2's little hero here on the Draven, was really able to step up and make that Nami for Lucian trade look worthwhile, which again, I'm seeing a lot of analysts and a lot of people I respect talking about the Nami Lucian trade as being like ridiculously Lucian favored, and I just don't think I agree with that. I think that Nami is really strong in her own right, and I think especially with something like Draven, which we've seen very consistently be pulled out as a counter to Lucian plus Enchanter, I think that is honestly very pro Nami, like very pro Draven Nami, and we kind of saw why in this series. We've seen why quite a few times globally over the course of the year so far. I just think Draven Nami is still an incredibly solid lane if you can play it at a high level. Aiming in Lehens definitely played it at a high level in this one. And then game number 3 was all BDD on this Azir. His 100th career Azir game is a pretty good one here, as he's able to take down Chovy on his signature champion. A very good look for him. BDD, if he can continue to just kind of be solid for this KT Rolster team, they have, you know, a player that's capable of carrying a lot of these series in aiming in the bottom lane. If BDD can be that fantastic supplementary secondary carry, what he was for such a long time on those Gen.G teams, that's going to be huge for KT, and it's really going to allow them to prove that they can be one of the top teams in the league. Now, it's not, you know, all sunshine and rainbows. They have relatively been inconsistent over the course of the year. A lot of that has come from the top side and mostly has come from the jungle position there with Cuz. The inconsistency that Cuz offers you can be a little bit problematic, but when he's on, when he plays well like he did pretty much all of this week, and especially in this series, this team is really good, and we know Kian can be a very positive force in the top lane. Everybody's kind of clicking for KT right now. Now, obviously, I really hope that they're able to keep this up, because there are some major question marks on this team in terms of consistency, like I already said. Not just the top side, but pretty much everybody on this team has had moments this year where they've not looked particularly good, maybe with the exception of Aiming and Lehens in the bot lane, who have looked pretty good for KT overall. But looking at this win in general, being able to pick up a win against a Gen.G team that honestly has looked very good over the start of the season is huge for this team, and really proves that they deserve to be in that upper echelon conversation. As for Gen.G, on the other hand, definitely a frustrating way to lose your second series of the year. You really shouldn't be losing to a team like KT, and honestly, you just kind of underperformed. Like, you were not the better team here today. It wasn't some, you know, oh, KT was able to pull out a game, you know, they were better one game and then they were able to pull out a second one. No, like, they were the better team in this series by a large margin, and that is a little bit concerning. My dud of the series is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane. I haven't been particularly talkative about Chovy so far in 2023. That's because I think a lot of Gen.G's success has come from Chovy supporting the rest of his team. Pez and Delight really stepping up. Doran obviously had some really good series. I think Peanut has been this team's best player so far this year. That definitely translated to the series as well, where I thought Peanut was really important in their Game 1 win, and honestly was okay in their Games 2 and 3 losses. Just couldn't particularly do all that much when the rest of his lanes were losing, but Chovy was not good in this series, was honestly outplayed by BDD. Not a particularly good sign. Now, obviously, I'm not going to freak out and say that Chovy's washed or something like that after just a couple of games here against KT Rolster, but I think maybe in the next couple of series, I'd really like to see Chovy step up, really take on that carry role once more, just so I know that he still has it in him in 2023 and that the team knows how to play around Chovy in that manner, because so far, we really have not seen that out of Gen.G. He was pretty good at the start of the year, but for the most part, he really has been a supportive threat for people like Pez and Peanut, and so I would really like to see him step up. This series was certainly not one of his best, but nobody was really all that great here. I think Pez and Delight certainly had moments where they looked okay, but for the most part, Aiming and Lehens just had way more of an impact on the game. Like I said, I thought Peanut was pretty good, but Doran was outplayed in the top lane here. I would say the biggest diff in the game was definitely mid lane, and that's really where Gen.G started to fall behind a ton, in my opinion, but overall, Gen.G is definitely going to be able to move on from this. This doesn't really seem like a team that is going to freak out over losses. They lost their first series of the year to T1, mind you, but losing to KT is not exactly what they wanted on their 2023 bingo card, and unfortunately, they're going to have to rebound now. This Gen.G team certainly hasn't faced a lot of adversity this year. This is going to be a nice little first touch. I imagine they're going to be able to rebound rather nicely, though. As for KT Rolster, huge week and huge win for them here. Hopefully they can keep this up. I'm not going to say the E word. I'm just not going to. But hopefully they can keep this up, because right now KT Rolster is playing at an incredibly high level. And, you know, this is a team that on paper a lot of people told me should be competing for top 4. Well, they're playing like it right now. Hopefully they can keep it up, because, you know, if they can, then that's going to be a huge boon to all the KT Rolster fans in my comments section. That's going to bring us to our final day of LCK Week 4 action here, and we kicked off our final day with a battle between two potential playoff teams in Hanwha Life Esports and Dplus KIA, and DK picks up a huge win here. Really needed. They have been on a little bit of a downswing. You know, 4-3, not a bad record, but you were 4-1 just a couple of games ago, and so you really needed to stop the bleeding, and I think you absolutely did that in a series where you held complete and utter control of pretty much every minute of action. You looked great. pretty much everybody on your team looked great. This is kind of how you wanted to bounce back. As for Hanwha, you were on a little bit of a hot streak coming into this game, and that definitely cooled off a bit as we entered playing against Dplus. And so, unfortunately, only one of these teams is going to be walking out with any sort of confidence after this one. But DK looking really, really good. Player of the series, another couple of options. You know, when the whole team plays well, it's kind of hard to give one person player of the series. But for me, my player of the series is going to go to Kellen in the support position. Kellen has been incredibly underrated, in my opinion, for a long time now. I remember liking him back in his Gen.G days, where it really felt like he was fun to watch, you know, switching in and out with life. Then he finally got a full shot on Nongshim, and that team came very close to making the World Championships, obviously, last year. Spent it here in Damwon and looked really, really good, was the better part of that bot lane duo, and now is a part of a very dominant bot lane duo with Deft. I think he's finally getting a chance to prove that he really is one of the best supports in the world. I think he has been that for a little while now, and I think he's just getting a little bit more of a light on him, I would say, overall. He was one of the two best players on Damwon last year, in my opinion, alongside Canyon, and so to see him really get to step up and, you know, kind of show people that he deserves that label over the course of 2023, it's been a lot of fun. Him and Deft have been incredibly good in the lane 2v2, but Kellen's real strength is being able to carry that into the mid game. I talk about this a lot when it comes to supports. It's really, you know, it's cool that you're able to generate nice leads in the 2v2, but you got to be able to do something with them. There's quite a few supports that are able to generate leads relatively consistently, but they don't really know how to change that into anything remotely positive over the course of the rest of the game. Kellen does that at an incredibly high level. His mid game is very, very highly rated compared to a lot of the other supports I would consider top tier in the world, and I think we see that basically on a game-to-game basis. Whether it's Lux, whether it's Nami, he's good at engagers as well, don't get me wrong. He's just a very versatile and very strong support. Deft is following up on it at an incredibly high level. Caitlyn Lux has really been a go-to for this Dplus team over the course of the beginning of the year. I expect that to continue. Obviously, Lucian Nami has also been a huge go-to. I was talking about this earlier. Get them off of that. You have to either take it or ban it. They have played that most of the games this year so far. These are the two bot lanes that I think this team is most comfortable playing at a super high level. I'm not going to say that these are the two that I'm going to expect the most out of them and for them to only play or anything like that, but these are the two that I would expect them to prioritize, I would say, over others. I still think they can play Zeri. Obviously, Deft can play like Ezreal and things like that. I'm not particularly, you know, sitting here saying like, oh, Damwon's or Dplus is locked in terms of what they can play in the support position in the bot lane, but I do think that these definitely play to their strengths, and they definitely looked it in this series. The other player that you got to shout out is, of course, Kana up in the top lane on this Renekton, diving into the backline, completely destroying the backline of Hanwha Life in that game number 2 in particular. The Azir and the Zeri had absolutely no chance. I mean, Kingen, you know, we'll talk about him in a bit, but Kingen just ignoring the Renekton in general, absolutely no one peeling for the backline on the side of Hanwha, and just the entire backline getting completely and utterly destroyed was quite funny to watch. But credit to Kana for executing on that. He looks good when the rest of the team looks good. I'm still interested to see if he's going to be one of those players that can drag a Dplus up when the rest of the players aren't necessarily playing at their top level. But for now, Kana is looking really good. Canyon was awesome. Showmaker was still really good, even though he was a little over-aggressive. I still think, you know, somehow, some way he's been this team's weakest player over the course of the year so far. But I mean, everybody on DK looked really, really solid in the series. It's hard to find any sort of negatives that you could point out and say, like, these are concrete. It's mostly just, you know, I wish they would have played slightly more aggressive. But on the side of Hanwha, not a particularly good series. When you have one team that's kind of dominating every lane, that means the other team is probably struggling in every lane, and that's kind of what happened here. I think that there were a lot of options for Dud of the series. The only one that I think played relatively okay is going to be Zeka in the mid lane. Again, when the rest of this team folds and collapses, he really seems like the one who is going to be stepping up and playing relatively consistently. I've always liked Zeka. He's always been very good, even when the rest of the team around him isn't particularly performing well. We saw that a ton last year on DRX, and we're seeing that again on Hanwha. He was okay in the series, and I think you can make a case that he was better than Showmaker from a pure micro standpoint, but at the end of the day, you know, Showmaker was significantly more effective because he had significantly more room to work with when it came to a lot of these plays. But everybody else on Hanwha Life lost. Viper and Life were just significantly outplayed by Deft and Kellen. It looks like we kind of know what Viper and Life are going to be. They're going to be able to step up and play pretty well against some of the other bottom bot lanes in the league, or even some of the mid-tier bot lanes. They should be able to outpace them, but Viper and Life against Deft and Kellen, Viper and Life against Guma and Keria, I'm not exactly sold that they are going to be on the same level as those players. They're going to be somewhere between 3 and 4. They're not going to be the number 1 bot lane in the LCK, which is a little bit disappointing, but also, you know, at least we're starting to get an idea of what the expectations are for this team, because they were very difficult to pin down. Viper was not very good when it came to positioning in this series. I would say he was worse than Life which is not something I've said a lot over the course of the year so far, but Viper was just not very good in this one. And then my dud of the series is going to go to Klid. I already talked about how King failed to peel. Klid failed to do anything. He failed to peel, he failed to gain any jungle control, he failed to get any objectives. Klid just had another one of those bad series. This very much felt like week 1 Klid all over again, and that's not particularly great to see. Obviously, I think he can bounce back. We've seen him bounce back this year already. Hopefully, it's just one bad series against a really good team, against the best jungler in the region, and it's not, you know, some underlying problem, but the inconsistency that Klid has offered this team in 2023 has been a pretty massive problem for Hanwha, and it's been a big reason why they're sitting here at 4-4 instead of higher. He has been the dud of the series in almost every single series that Hanwha Life has lost this year, even though he has also been the player of the series in quite a few of the ones that they have won. He is really the thread that I think this entire team hangs on, but overall for Hanwha, you know, it's a frustrating loss. You're sitting at 4-4, but at least it was to a good team this time. You know, getting blown out is never fun, but at least you're not getting blown out by some of the bottom teams like you were earlier on in the year. So hopefully you can believe that this team is just going to be able to bounce back, keep that hot streak that they had before this series going into next week when they face some easier competition. As for DK, a good bounce back here. You really needed to pick up a win in this series, in my opinion. You did not want to be moving into week number 5 sitting at 4-4, especially after how you started the year, you know, how competitive you looked and how you were dominating people. This team definitely still has its problems. I still think the solo laners raise some major question marks for me, but the jungle bot lane like trio here is just so ridiculously strong that they should be able to take out a lot of the mid-tier competition in the LCK, basically just off the back of those 3 players. Hopefully they can keep it up, and then hopefully players like Kana and Showmaker can get back into form so that this team can really compete at the highest level like we want them to. And now moving into our final series of the week here, and it's a good one. It's a rematch of the 2022 League of Legends World Finals. A little bit of a different context, I would say here, but we had T1 taking on DRX, and T1 gets the job done. 1-6 DRX, obviously very much struggling at the moment to pick up really any sort of momentum, any sort of traction in any games at all, and that definitely showed itself off here against T1, who just kind of obliterated them in every single facet. We had a lot of obliterations in the LCK this week, not a lot of particularly close series, but T1 definitely looking solid here. Player of the series for me on the side of T1 is going to go to Zeus in the top lane. That Fiora in game number 1 was like legitimately disgusting. He was dominating the map. He was running around. No one could stop him. He obliterated Rascal on the Cassante in lane. He was pressuring side waves. He was pressuring team fights. He was doing everything for the team. He looked unstoppable. Really good game from him. And he was still incredibly successful on the Sion in game number 2. Now, obviously, Sion can be unkillable against the low damage teams. And that's what DRX had. They had Jhin. They had Ashe. They had Sylas. Like, none of these guys are really going to be bursting down the Sion all that easily, and so he was really able to just walk in like 1v4 in a lot of these fights, be able to survive, set up a lot of time for the rest of his team, and then be able to win the fight basically for his own team. Zeus continues to be the best top laner in the world. I don't even think it's really all that disputable right now. He is just unbelievable. He destroyed Rascal in lane, which we will get to in a bit, but Zeus just awesome. What can I really say about him? I mean, what can I say that hasn't already been said? He is amazing. Rest of the team is also really good. I think you could realistically think about giving player of the series here to Owner. Owner's kind of been on, you know, tank duty for a little while. I think he's fantastic on the likes of Sejuani. He showed that in game number 1, but it is good to see him go to his signature Nidalee every once in a while. Obviously, he's been watching June over in the LPL try and pull it off and not really be super successful. To see Owner be able to pull it out here and just kind of dominate the series on it, dominate the game on the Nidalee. Very, very fun to watch. Nidalee's always one of those champions where when she's winning, she's really, really fun to watch and really, really fun to cheer for. When she's losing, not so much, obviously. Go ahead and talk to June about that, but Owner looked really good in this series. I think the other players that looked really good for T1, obviously everybody, but Guma and Keria continue to look like the best bot lane in the LCK, maybe even over Deft and Kellen. The problem is that both of them play Caitlyn at a ridiculously high level. Ignore the fact that Keria flash netted into Ashold. We didn't see that. No one saw that. We're not going to talk about that. Both of them play Caitlyn at a world-class level, and it's fun to watch. Varus Caitlyn is ridiculously oppressive, especially post-6. Very difficult to actually try and trade and deal with, even when you yourself have a lot of CC as well. If you don't really have a lot of ways to burst them down early on in fights, they're going to be very difficult. They're going to make fights very difficult for you to be able to play out front to back, and that's exactly what happened here. Guma and Keria continue to be top tier, and Faker's Faker. I mean, what do you really want me to say about him? For DRX on the other side, They're not good. They're not good. This World Finals rematch didn't really feel like a World Finals rematch when the world champion, the reigning world champion, walked into it 1-6. It's not particularly what I think we were all looking for, but unfortunately, it was the one world champion on this roster of DRX that disappointed in this one. Barrel's going to be getting my dud of the series again here. I think you could very realistically give this to Rascal in the top lane, who was terrible, but there are a couple reasons I want to give this to Barrel. First of all, I don't think he hit an Ash Arrow in game number 2. Obviously, he hit one, but outside of that, I don't think he hit a single other one. And the one he did hit was Keria literally flash netting into it instead of out of it, and so I don't even think you can give that one to Barrel. I think the funny one that we're all looking at is that clip of Barrel shooting the Ash Arrow at Rascal. I don't think you can Ash Arrow your own teammate as much as you might want to with how much Rascal was feeding up on the top side, but still quite a funny little story there. Barrel continues to be horrendous in lane, and he continues to be just as bad out of lane. He is one of the worst players in the LCK right now, as he was, honestly, for parts of summer of last year as well. So it's not particularly surprising, but it is frustrating. I honestly, and I know Reddit's gonna hate me for saying this, I feel so bad for Dectum. I honestly think Dectum's really not playing all that bad. His positioning is really good in a lot of these fights. He's not really getting out a ton of damage, but it's not really his job on this team to get out like a ridiculous amount of damage. It's to kind of clean up what Akali and what Sylas and Wukong really set up for you, especially when you're on that Jhin. And Dectum's positioning really well. He's not really putting himself in bad scenarios. He's not giving away gold. He's trying to stay even in lanes, even when his support is feeding. It just doesn't matter. His support is so bad that he ends up losing every single lane phase. I would be so tilted if I was Dectum right now. I don't really know what else I would do. I would be losing my mind watching him play this game if I was Dectum, but I guess it's the typical solo queue experience, huh? Rascal was awful on the top side. Krako got completely out-jungled by Owner in this one, and then Fate was just not as good as Faker. Overall, DRX just kind of meh, right? They're a bad team, and they got beat by a very good team. It's not particularly surprising. This very well could be the best team in the league, just beating up on the worst team in the league, and I think that's what we saw. Outlook-wise, DRX sucks. I mean, they're a bottom 2 team at the absolute best right now. They are a team that is looking nowhere even close to playoffs, which is just a disaster for this roster on paper. Even the players that were playing well at the beginning of the year, like Rascal, are just really starting to turn in an awful performance. He was atrociously bad in both of their series this week. Dectum's trying his best, but there's only so much you can do from the AD carry spot when you're not able to generate early leads because your support is running it down. Krako and Fate are ridiculously inconsistent and kind of fold when they play against any sort of relevant competition. I just don't think DRX is all that good, and they prove that basically game after game. As for T1, huge win. You're still number 1 in the power rankings, in my opinion. A little bit of a spoiler for the segment that's coming up in a second, but this team is just untouchable when they play at their level. Like, when they are playing their game and they're not letting themselves get sucked into the game of whatever opponent that they're playing, they are just the best team in the LCK, and it's not particularly close. Zeus is the best top laner in the world. Guma and Keria are playing like the best bot lane in the world. Faker's the GOAT, and Owner looks really, really solid, even on the tanks, but especially when he gets to play these more carry-oriented picks. Everything is working for T1 right now, and honestly, they're just an absolute blast to watch. Alright, that is going to do it for my Week 4 LCK overview and analysis of all 10 series across 5 days here. Really, really fun stuff up on the screen. Right now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings from number 1 to number 10. In the first column on the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the biggest risers, biggest followers. First thing I want to say before we jump into the power rankings, some of these teams are going to be too high or too low for you. I really do think more so than ever right now, we have brackets of teams in the LCK. I just need to see a tad bit more from some of these teams, which I will get into, but I feel bad with some of the movement that has had to happen in some of the power rankings, which we will get to. Obviously, biggest riser this week, going to be no surprise, going to be KT Rolster, jumping from number 6 in my power rankings only to number 4. Some people are going to put them at number 2. Hell, I've seen people put them at number 1 right now. They're just not consistent enough for me to feel comfortable with that at all. They beat number 2 and number 3 in my power rankings, so how can I not put them at number 2? Well, those of you who follow my channel for a long time know that my power rankings are not just simply, well, who did they beat? It's a projection of, if these two teams played a best of 5 right now, who do I think would win? And I'm just not sure with the consistency problems that they've had so far that I think KT would reasonably beat Gen.G or DM1, or Dplus, sorry, in a best of 5. Now, I could be very wrong about that. I don't think the gap between them is huge, but if KT continues to go on these 2-0 weeks, if they can actually beat up on some of the bottom teams more consistently, if they can beat Liiv SANDBOX, if they can beat Hanwha, if they can beat BRION, and they can look good doing it, I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable putting them at number 2. But for now, I just need to see them do it. They had a very good week this week, but there were a lot of teams that had very good weeks, you know, multiple times throughout last year that couldn't sustain it over the course of a year. So that's my little spiel on why KT only jumps up to number 4. But unfortunately, because of that, Liiv SANDBOX falls to number 5. They go 2-0. They're sitting 6-2, and they fall to number 5. That sucks, but really, I do think that talent-wise, they're just not on the same level as the top 4, who all feel very established right now. Hanwha drops to number 6 as well. That one doesn't really need as much explaining. KDF jumps all the way up to number 8 here. They beat Nongshim. They're definitely better than the bottom 2, in my opinion, right now, and I think that's clear to see, especially if Dudu plays like that in the top lane. And then DRX and Nongshim definitely prove they're the bottom 2. Put them in whatever order you want. You want DRX at 10? Fine. You want Nongshim at 10? Fine. I think Nongshim's slightly worse. At least DRX has some upside with some of the players they have there. I just don't think Nongshim's going to come together this year, but those are my power rankings. As for my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 4, my player of the week is going to go to Bertle on Liiv SANDBOX. A really good week from Bertle. He was actually fantastic in both of their series, and it's really good to see a player that honestly was just put in a situation that he wasn't quite prepared for on Damwon last year, kind of get another shot on an org that maybe has a little bit less of a responsibility on him and really come through. Bertle's been really solid this year, and he very much deserved player of the week in my opinion. Other candidates definitely aiming for KT Rolster. Hard to not mention him at all. And then KIA or Zeus, whoever you want to mention on T1, they were really good this week as well. Dud of the week in week number 4 for me is going to go to Rascal on the side of DRX. He was just atrocious in their top lane matchups, both of them this week, where he kind of got run off the rift. I really like Rascal. At points, I was calling him maybe the best top laner in the world. He just has not been good ever since this DRX team exploded. He was probably their saving grace at the beginning of the year, but it is not sustained. He was the worst player in the LCK this week, and I don't think it was particularly close. The only other player that I think even has a running for that title is Din on Nongshim. He was my honorable mention, but really this was a pretty easy choice to give this one to Rascal. He didn't have a single game this week where it felt like he was remotely competent, and that is frustrating. Hopefully he'll be able to bounce back, but Rascal's my dud of the week, and Bertle is my player of the week. But that's gonna do it. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comment section below. Who's too high, who's too low? I know there's going to be a little bit of contention when it comes to my power ranking, so I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback so long as you're respectful about it down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel, and I really do appreciate it. And then, of course, if you're new, hit subscribe. Not only do I do LCK, I do all 4 major regions, as well as the NACL weekly recaps, so you can get those all on this channel. Get all your League of Legends, LoL Esports stuff here. I would really appreciate it. It really means a lot to me. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.